And welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast, where we are talking again this week about Masters of the Air this time. Last week, I said Master and Commander when I was doing the intro and didn't realize. Yeah, you guys were like, let's talk about Russell Crowe. I'm in. So,
dude, I would love it if we talked about, Master and Commander. That'd be amazing. That's one of my favorite movies of all time.
Already.
I know, you already did it, but it wasn't with me. That's the problem.
We'll go back and do Master Commander again. I don't care. That's all fine and good. Of course, we are joined once again by our SETI group. We're talking about co-pilot Dr. Sarah Myers, our navigator Dr. Colin Colbourn, and of course our bombardier Dr. Luke Truxal. Folks, I worked that up right before we jumped in. Welcome back to the pod where we're talking about episode 6, which in our text this week we're like, oh, this is a little bit more laid back of it. You were saying that, Luke. You're like, oh, this is a relaxing episode. Sir, you're a liar. Compared to where we were, I felt a little, it was less stressful. I mean, yes, it's intense at times, but we're having lectures at Oxford too. So, I mean, we're not like doing a mission over Munster where we're getting wiped out. We get cutscenes to Oxford where we get to talk about, English literature, American, British history. I mean, there's some nice scenes in there that kind of bring the tension down. But yes, Egan's escape and invasion episode, parts of the episode, that's intense. But compared to some of the other ones we've done, it brought the temperature down for me a little bit. Yeah, and you picked up a little bit on the whole Oxford-Cambridge, thing going on when we had the punter. We're going to talk about what the punter is here in a second, but yeah, absolutely. Colin, you're going to say something?
I was going to say I got the text that it was going to be a chill, therapeutic episode.
No,
and I was like, okay,
not.
I had like a hot cup of tea. I was ready to go. And then someone's face is getting smashed in with a shovel, and people are getting shot. And I was like, what episode is Luke watching? I literally had to go, am I watching the right episode? Did 2 come out the same day?
Comparatively.
Think about some of the episodes we've watched compared to the others. This is actually kind of a little bit down.
And I'd already seen the episode, so I was just really excited to see how you all took it as you watched the episode after Luke's text. So I just was entertained over here.
Yeah, Luke is like, yeah, it's less stressful, and it's our first time we've actually seen the Holocaust on the series so far. I mean, so it's like, oh, cup of tea, this will be lovely. And I'm watching it Saturday morning at like 8 a.m. with my Cuban coffee ready to go. And I can't quite see because the lights come in, so I'm having to move around in the house and so forth. And yeah, there's a lot going on here. It did feel at times like a bit of a change of pace episode, almost like breather, because you can't just go bombs away.
Yeah. I think that's probably what I was trying to convey, is that it was less intense in terms of the combat, but there's still a lot of heavy stuff being dealt with, but it didn't feel like at times that your heart was constantly racing, wondering who's going to get blown out of the sky next. So again, it was one of those ones where it's hard to describe how it's a little bit more slower. I don't even know, slower pace. It's hard to find the right words to describe the episode, but it's a definitely change of pace episode.
Yeah, Sarah, what'd you think?
I thought it was change of pace, so I noticed us all nodding that we all agree about that. But I also thought that it was really heavy, so I don't really have anything to add otherwise, in terms of my impressions, except that it just felt justifiably dark and heavy. So
yes.
I mean, it's character development, right? Like we're really digging in at this point, I think, to a few characters very seriously, which we haven't really done as much before. We're really, when we're in the air, we're dealing with full crews of people, a lot of dudes that have masks on. You can't tell sort of who they are. We have kind of our main characters, but now we're really, really, I think, diving in. And that way, I think it was very different from what we've seen so far.
I do always like the opening lines of the episodes. Sorry, Luke. What'd you say, Luke?
That's all right.
Okay, you can go back.
I think this is the direction we're going to go.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that I thought they did a good job setting us up with the opening lines, like they have been all the episodes, because this one was about tiptoeing around ghosts, which I thought the ghosts take many forms, right? So I liked how they set us up at the beginning.
Yeah, I wrote that down myself, and you're absolutely right, Colin. I think that this show certainly, we see this transition. We kind of felt it coming with the last episode too, where we kind of feel like this was becoming the Rosie Rosenthal show a little bit. Certainly Egan, I think more than any single person, this certainly felt kind of centered on Egan and Crosby and Rosenthal. And then of course we've got the big reveal towards the end that we'll talk about in a moment. So, and I welcome that. Like this was like a different understanding of what warfare is for these crewmen, for these soldiers of the sky, if you will. So
yeah, I think Sarah, one of the quotes to your point, Sarah, was tiptoeing around their ghosts, I think was one of the direct quotes from the episode. So I definitely think that that's an apt way to say it.
Yeah,
actually,
I wrote that down too.
One of the things that I noticed is that, with the tiptoeing around the ghosts, I like how they portrayed an element of evasion, but also you see Egan constantly running. The thing that kept coming in my mind is everybody's running from something. Crosby's running from one thing, which we revealed later in the episode. Rosie's running from another thing. And Egan's physically running, but also emotionally running from some of the consequences of his actions in the lead up to the episode. So again, I noticed running from these issues was a thing. And at the end, everybody, I won't say comes to some kind of resolution, but they come to grips with the realities. They can't escape what has happened.
I like these themes that you come up with every time. This is great.
I know, right? You guys want to jump into the spoiler-filled recap of this? Because I've got one major question, which is how the hell does John Egan continue to survive this series? If the man can survive this episode, I mean, good Lord. I mean, I thought at first when we saw the trailers for last week, it's like, oh, he's going to get in the water. No, he's not going to escape that at all. And my other thought as I was writing down, I wrote down tiptoe around ghosts, but I also wrote down that water must be cold when Egan, because you're talking about October in Westphalia. That sounds, I mean, I still know how to say Americana as well, so that was nice. So
That's right. Yeah, no, I think they just did a really, honestly, there was a lot of stuff, and we're gonna dive into a lot of the things that I think they did extremely well in this episode. But a lot of airmen really faced a lot of problems when they got down onto the ground with German civilians. And they did, of course, sort of, and many times land right around where they had just bombed a whole bunch of people. And I was really curious, so I dove into some of the stuff from the 398th Bomb Group, who obviously was in the war later. And I just was like, I'll read just several of the POW accounts. And in almost every one of them, they talked about some of their guys either being killed. Some guy lost all his teeth because a farmer with a pickaxe went at him. And then there's this story of Murder Inc. Luke, are you familiar with this story of Murder Inc.?
No, I'm not familiar with the.
Yeah, so I heard this story. I was reading about this, and this is actually something that I wasn't familiar with until I sort of started digging in. And in November of 1943, some guys, I won't go into too many details, but they got shot down. And couple of the crew members happened to have a flight jacket, and on the back it said Murderers Inc., which was the name of an aircraft that they were supposed to be flying in as a crew, but of course they never even ended up flying in that individual plane. But they were captured and photographed, and then Joseph Goebbels actually came in and did a whole propaganda thing that said that these guys were Chicago gangsters who were here to murder civilians, that they were just hired gangsters to come over, really vilifying and making, these Americans out to be evil and inciting civilians against downed airmen. And so it wasn't even just about the bombing. This is something that the Germans, the Nazis themselves, are perpetuating as well. And I thought that was a really interesting thing.
That's interesting because I had heard the propaganda about American airmen being referred to as gangsters, but I never knew the backstory behind it. So I had heard kind of some of the talking points, and I've seen it come up a few times of how Goebbels kind of tries to describe American bombers and crews as gangsters, but I never knew the origins of that propaganda. So that's interesting and nice to know in terms of just kind of having that story to give context.
That's not the first time I've heard of Germans keying in on what they perceive to be American history when writing these these propaganda pieces. I know in World War One, they absolutely keyed on the fact that there were American Indian soldiers who were fighting in the war, and the stories they would tell about American Indians, the fears of scalping, or keying in on what Germans perceived to be American Indian stories, they used to kind of frighten the German populace into resistance as well. So, and I'm sure you guys study this far more than I do. We do the exact same thing when we're talking about our opponents, in combat, using their own histories against them, or the perceptions of their own histories against them as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, what is, to me, when someone says, this about propaganda in order to vilify their foe, I immediately think of the Pacific. Obviously, I brought up the Pacific a lot in this, and I know that we're jumping across the ocean, across the world. But obviously in the Pacific, the Japanese did that, to their civilians as well. Saipan, Okinawa, Japanese are saying that these Marines are all rapists and murderers, and they're really just invading to rape and pillage you all, and that the best outcome for you is just to go either fight against them. That was their hope, or to commit suicide and just sort of end it before the Marines get to you. And so I actually had not heard of as much of the Germans, because, often when we simplify the two theaters, we often sort of say, I say we, but I mean, I'm just sort of thinking of in popular culture, it's often like that there's this civilized war that's going on in Germany. And I don't mean the Holocaust, but I just mean sort of this, white folk v. white folk kind of thing. And then there's a sort of a race war almost that's happening in the Pacific, and the vilification of each other. And yet here you see some of those dirty quote unquote tactics happening. And that's getting down to airmen killed. It was not getting out of the airplane was not the end of the danger by any stretch.
Yeah, Colin, you talked a little bit earlier about the things that you really liked about this episode. You want to jump in more and talk about some of the other stuff that you saw? Of course, you really got three different storylines here going, right? You've got Egan's overlapping storyline of just trying to survive, ultimately ending up in the prisoner of war camp. I don't know how the man, when they got to the town that had been bombed out, was that Munster that they were at, where they had bombed it out, and then the populace just loses their marbles and starts attacking the crew, right? Mm-hmm. You've got Crosby. Let's talk about Egan's journey. Then we'll do Crosby, and then we'll talk about Rosie as well, and kind of go from there. What else did you guys like about the Egan storyline?
Well, something I want to bring up, because I did a lot of sort of digging into it, because it's one of the biggest questions, and it's the interrogation that Egan faced when he gets sort of into German custody. My brother Brian asked me, he was like, how do they, this is the most fake sounding episode, because they really must have sort of skipped over the history here, because he knew so much about this individual. Like, how could he have known that? And I was watching with my wife, Rachel. She said, she was also asking, like, how do they know so much about the individual? And you hear, I think I've heard, many sort of these stories. And so I wanted to look into further. And I broke down when I was watching it the second time. Did you guys feel that way? Did you guys feel like it really struck you how much they knew about him? I was wondering how they,
pre-internet. Yeah, and also I was having the thoughts about Inglourious Basterds. So I was like, "Is this Hans Landa?" It's just everything. It's like, Germans. There's this undertone of menace. I'm sorry, Luke.
To answer Colin, I wasn't surprised, because I had heard those stories before, and I interviewed POWs, a B-24 pilot, who basically said they had his life story right there in front of him, and basically, the initial way the conversation started is, we don't need anything from you. We got everything we want. And then it's kind of, at that point, it's a very subtle way to try to draw the intelligence. But basically, they start by this kind of truth bomb of a bunch of information, not just personal about them, but also about the group as well. And this is I should say, and Colin can probably go into more detail, but this is a purely Luftwaffe interrogation tactic by a specific group within the Luftwaffe. The Gestapo does it differently, much more violent, much more torture. Same for other units. And it's not because the Luftwaffe is like, clean or good in any way. This is an interrogation tactic that the Luftwaffe thought was more effective, which is to basically scare the American airmen with the knowledge that you have already about them, and then subtly draw the information you need out through the conversation. Not necessarily
I think to the filmmaking, I think they did it so well, because when I went back through, I said, wow, how did they know all of this information about him? Because it also sort of felt that way to me. But when I went back through the pieces of information that he knew, personal information that he knew about Egan, his name, his rank, his serial number, his hometown, and that he's not married. That's it. That's the only personal information that he knew. But the way it was presented on screen made it, like you said, Luke, they give this truth bomb. They're like, we know everything about you, and then basically just the information they found in his wallet, it's sort of like that can tell you everything you need to know. And on top of that, first off, of course, I don't know why they didn't just Google this information, but I did. And what I found actually was that Egan had appeared, and Buck Clevin had appeared in quite a few articles in the London press over August, September, October 1943, talking about their raids. And so these are papers, and of course they allude to this in the scene itself, which is, again, so great. Obviously, the Germans had spies. The Germans, they knew. They knew when the 100th Bomb Group, arrived. They knew a lot of these things because they have spies, and of course they can get a lot of that information. What bomb group he's in, all those things. That's easy information really to discern. But I found that it was really interesting because the personal information, you could find that from a guy's wallet. Anything that was taken off of him, next of kin information is often on these guys. Cards, other kinds of things, because of course they do that when in order to be identified as well. And so really there wasn't a whole lot of information that would have been insane. Now, to Luke's point, I was looking up some amazing stories about one bomber crewman was shot down, and his interrogator was an SF officer who said, your dad's a grocer in Philadelphia. Your girlfriend in high school's name was this. And it turned out that guy actually lived down the street from him, grew up in Buffalo, New York, and lived and knew his whole family, and just ended up going to Germany to take care of his grandmother before the war. And so there's some, of course, some interesting things like that, but their interrogation techniques were so we already know all this personal information. So just tell us how many B-17s were shot down. It seems like it's nothing. So anyway, that part of the show I thought was honestly so well done. Clearly someone really paid attention to these guys talking about how they were interrogated.
80%.
Yeah, because I was thinking that they must look at... Oh, sorry. Sorry, I keep talking at the same time as you, Luke. So there was this Tuskegee Airman who's a POW in the same Luftwaffe-controlled camp. I looked it up that... Egan was in, that he was transferred to. And so I'm wondering if they'll end up bringing this guy in, because this guy was Alexander Jefferson and he wrote a memoir about his experiences. So maybe they'll pull him in. But either way, I remember in the book that he was talking about, again, not a super extensive information, but limited information that he was interrogated about. And he was surprised that the Germans knew anything about him. But it made me wonder when I was reading his memoir, if that's where they're getting the basic information, not from the case you're talking about, which is really interesting about the newspaper articles about Egan and Cleveland, but about the, basic info that he would have had on his personhood, right? Going in. Luke, you were going to say something wrong.
Yeah, going back to, again, Donald Miller put this actually in his book, is that, and again, if I'm reading this correctly, about 80% of the information they were able to gather on these guys came through personal effects that they were able to gather off the men when they landed and they were captured, or through these subtle little interrogation abilities. Like they even knew when like a bomb group's clock was broken. And they said, hey, did you fix that clock over in the... And again, that's a piece that you could draw out in these very subtle ways. And again, this is not to say that the Luftwaffe is clean or fighting this war. Yeah, that the Americans have that perception because of how these interrogations are different. But this is a tactic. This is a choice by the Luftwaffe to do things differently because they think it's more effective. So again, I don't want to give off this impression that the Luftwaffe is better than the SS or the Gestapo. No, they're not. There's a historian, I think it's Victoria Taylor, who's doing a good look at the Nazification of the Luftwaffe. But this is a choice to use these subtle tactics. And going back to kind of the evasion story, because we kind of went right into interrogation, you're asking about marching through the city and all that. They combined Frank Murphy's account with Egan's account over what happened with that. So Frank Murphy actually was marched through the city of Munster and had things thrown at him and an angry mob. Now, it didn't play out the way basically it happened on film. There was no murdering. To my knowledge, Frank Murphy and his comrades weren't killed. Well, Frank Murphy wasn't killed. He survived the war. But the point is that did actually happen. So they are combining and compiling certain stories into Egan's evasion story as well. So again, that Frank Murphy was the one from the hundreds that basically got marched through Munster. There's not a lot that I could find on Egan's evasion and capture, other than a lot of the guys that went down the Munster raid went to the prison camp first, went through the whole process first, and they're like, well, Egan was out there in the wild for trying to evade the Germans for a few days, and then they eventually caught him. But yeah, again, when you look at kind of, this whole process and this whole story being told, it's, for the most part, feels pretty real from what those who've looked at the air war have seen in terms of kind of, what airmen experienced.
Can I ask you guys a question? First of all, I thought this was really interesting in the ways because I didn't know that the Luftwaffe had its own investigation division. So this was really illuminating to me to understand how the German war machine operated. I didn't know that there were that part of the Luftwaffe. But I also want to ask you about kind of step a little bit maybe off to the side just a little bit, because we've seen these a little bit at times where some of the pilots are looking at one another and things like that. Obviously, we know Luftwaffe bombers and pilots also get shot down over Allied territory as well. So here's my question. Is there any sense between, say, RAF or United States Air Force or anything like that of relations between themselves and Luftwaffe on the scale of we're all flyboys kind of a thing or anything? Is there any sense of I don't want to say camaraderie. That's not the right word. But a sense of, I don't know, some sort of kinship between them? Do we, the way they kind of see the opposing member versus, say, how a Luftwaffe crewman might view, say, American Army or something like that? Is there a difference in the way these divisions and so forth are viewing one another?
Yeah, the American airmen view the Luftwaffe for the most part as kind of we're both kind of these men who fight in the air. And there is, again, you're right, camaraderie is probably the wrong word, but there is some kind of shared experience, I guess would be the right word, that they have a mutual respect for one another. And so, again, what the show's doing a good job is portraying kind of the American airman experience. And so these feelings and attitudes towards the Luftwaffe, which would be more positive than other parts of, Nazi Germany, this is what the American airmen are experiencing, and these connections and bonds. And again, I don't even know if it's bonds, but basically it's that kind of, we've both been fighting in the air. We both are these highly specialized pilots and crews. We both had that experience. We both kind of see ourselves in the same way. And so there is a level of, I guess you could say, respect that they have for one another. But again, I would say that you have to be careful with that, because that's what American airmen view, and they view the Luftwaffe differently than kind of how they actually are. And so, as I always tell my students, there's a difference between perception and reality, but perception still matters too. And so the American perception is these are guys that they should respect, and that because of how they, because they fly in the air and they fight them, and there's that mutual respect of that shared experience in combat. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that American perception is kind of the reality of who the Luftwaffe is. There definitely are an arm of, and again, getting into something you also mentioned, I hate to keep going on this. Mike Stout's done some great research on some of the other aspects of the Luftwaffe. They had actually infantry divisions, field divisions, including an entire tank division, the Hermann Goering Tank Division. So the Luftwaffe is kind of a part of this apparatus that we have in Nazi Germany. And what Hitler did have multiple factions and multiple entities and groups that had their own militaries and organizations vying for power. And again, I don't feel like I'm the best person to speak about this aspect of it, but again, you got other historians, German historians, who've done more research into this, look at the Nazification and also these complex bureaucratic institutions that existed as well. Sorry.
That was fantastic, Luke. I think there also, to speak to this question, there's like a way of thinking about pilot culture specifically. And I know that we're talking about air crews here as well, but I was thinking about the moment with the woman who is from potentially British intelligence. It's like a little bit unclear what her assignment is and what she's doing. But when she's talking to Crosby and she tells him that he's not like quote unquote cocky enough to be a pilot, this, perceived, and it's perceived among like Americans as well, right? That within like American culture, but also American like society and, civilians, this idea of like the mythic image of a pilot as this person who's like highly skilled and professional, but is doing something that is very romanticized in pop culture because they're performing work and, literally flying at altitudes that Americans find to be like fascinating, right? Because the average person can't fly a plane and doesn't know how to like do this. And so I was thinking about it with regards to just like general pilot culture and the ways that stereotypically you have to have a lot of confidence, and often a certain personality comes from the training to become a pilot, and that's evident to even like civilians.
Can I ask about the interrogation? One more question about this, because the Luftwaffe officer kind of refers to the Gestapo as like, oh, you don't want to go talk to those guys. They've got a lot. Like, how much of that, guys, is play versus a hey, I'm the good cop, bad cop kind of thing versus do other divisions within German command really not like the Gestapo? Is there a sense of that as well? You see this over and over. And I remember when I was taking a course on World War II in film, when we watched Das Boot, right? And these were the submarine guys, and they kept referring to the Nazis who they couldn't stand, and these were still German submarine crews. So was there a sense that is there a division within the divisions over the Gestapo, or is that a good cop bad cop kind of thing?
I mean, there's no doubt that there's a separation between one that's maybe the military, and the one that is sort of like the police, right? And there's a separation there in itself, and of course a very politicized, police, etc. I would definitely, I don't know if it's a hollow threat though. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. My guess is it's a hollow threat because, especially with someone like a major, like these, you have to remember these guys are pretty high ranking officers as well. And so like if you're the Luftwaffe and you have of course, Luftwaffe had their prison camps, the Stalag Luft, prison camps, you are going to probably want to keep the high ranking prisoners with your camp. And I think Stalag Luft 3, back to Sarah's sort of research on that too, they had like over the course of the war, 2 other bomb group commanders and a brigadier general at one point in time as well, all shot down. So I think that there's that, but I don't think I think it's a little hollow in some ways, but I definitely think there's a separation.
It's definitely.
It does also remind me of how, like, not all, even German civilians or people in the German military, as like Christopher Browning's research about the firing squads, right? The men who were police officers before the war and then are, middle-aged, like not fighting, but rounding up people and like killing them via firing squad, like repeatedly. Like not all Germans, right, ascribe to Nazi like politics, etc. So I think it's a I can't speak to this exact situation, obviously, but it speaks to the fact that not everyone is on the same page politically, or even is on the same page with regards to how the war is going or decisions that are made, just like happens like everywhere, right? Luke, I think I cut you off again, Luke.
Oh, no, it's fine. But it is a bit of a hollow threat, because this is more of about tactics and trying to extract the information. The Luftwaffe actually recruited Germans who had lived in the United States, or American citizens who were coming back to Germany to do these interrogations, and so they could get all the references, about American pop culture. They could get all these things. They spoke very good English, but also, let's just not pretend that the Luftwaffe is doing this very humanely. They are actually breaking these guys down before they do this interrogation. And what I mean is that look at Egan's cell. It's cold, it's damp. In fact, some of the living conditions are far worse at these Luftwaffe interrogation centers. Also, they denied medical aid to a lot of these guys before they did the interrogations. One of the POWs that I had met and interviewed, were shot down in Albania, had an infection that needed surgery, and they did not give it to him till he got to the final, to the Stalag Luft 1. He had to limp through an interrogation with an infection in his, around his hip from where he fell through a tree. Would not let him get surgery until he got to the actual prison camp instead of the interrogation center. So these guys are not exactly following, any kind of rules laid out by the Geneva Convention on how to treat prisoners. They're trying to break them down, and then they give them this kind of truth bomb, and then they try to use this more delicate approach. But they're breaking them before they get them into that room. They have them in damp cells. They're not taking care of them. Some of them they're not giving enough food to. So you think about how they're sleep deprived. They're messing with their sleep schedule and all that. So they're sleep deprived. They're hungry. Some of them are badly injured and need medical care. And they're setting them up to basically be in a very bad condition for this really weird, awkward, laid-back conversation where they're going to kind of try to draw that information out. And that allows the interrogator also to kind of say, oh, you want some medical attention? Well, I can get that for you. Maybe just tell me how many, B-17s arrived at your bomb group, So again, let's just not pretend that it's a difference in tactics and a difference in approaches. But a lot of times that threat to send them to the Gestapo or the SS was hollow.
I think also it's important to remember that we had the 8th Air Force itself had lost almost 30, they had 30,000 POWs, right? So we're talking about 30,000 Americans going into these POW camps. And of course, the Nazis at this, they're fighting a war on multiple fronts, and, resources are low, of course, but you're going to put a lot of resources into interrogating this. These are your best, opportunities for human intelligence. 28,000 guys over the course of the war filtering into these camps. And yeah, Luke, you got to get them at their weakest. And yeah, it's fascinating. That's why this part was so good in my mind, because they did such a good job of sort of they're broken down, they're injured. Yeah. In many cases injured that will maim them the rest of their life. And it's like, you want a cigarette? Want some whiskey? Let's talk baseball. Let's, everything. It's just fine. Oh, you heard some guys got killed. You saw some guys got killed. Let me put it in my report. I'm so sorry. Let me put it in my report, etc. And those are tactics that are still used to this day, by the way. Those are not extinct in any way, shape, or form. So it's fascinating. I thought that was really well done here.
Has torture been officially banned at this point in time? Is torture a thing at this time during World War II in Europe?
Yes, because, and I always teach when I talk about this Philippine-American War and we're using waterboarding as torture, we're violating international law when we do that. So it's even in the 19th century. There's different sets and iterations of the laws, and I can't speak to the different iterations, but there are, again, though, it's during a time of war. So just like atrocities happen, people are picking and choosing in that moment what they're going to follow and what they're not, right? And so, yeah, but there is international law about it.
All right, I want to move on to something also torturous, which is called academia. We see a big portion of this episode talk about Crosby being taken off the line, if you will, and sent over to Oxford, where he is going to spend some time, like, kind of getting over Bubbles' loss, is the way that I'm seeing here. What are our thoughts on this? And what's going on here when they take Crosby to go hobnob with other officers and also a lady punter? We never quite understand what a punter is. We open with Crosby reading love letters from his wife, and then there's I'm texting you guys going, hey, I am in love right now. There are British brunettes on this show. That's great. Sarah's laughing right now. So what's going here with Crosby's story?
Luke, I'll let you take this one.
Okay, well, he's being asked and the way Crosby describes it is after the Munster raid, they tried to get some of these guys, especially with the originals, some time, with the original echelon, try to get them some way to reset mentally, at least get away from the, military aspect of this. And he does go to Oxford. He listens to a lot of lectures that are on American and British history. Some of it's English literature, but basically you have very low level people there and very high level people. The idea is it's an exchange of ideas. It's a way to build opportunities to work together, and it's kind of to help with bonding and having that shared experience as allies. So it's not just Americans and British. You have Poles there. And in fact, what's interesting is what didn't make it in. Jason, you would have loved it. Crosby talks about how they had a lecture on colonialism, and the British Major General giving the lecture on colonialism. One of the reasons he wanted to give that lecture is because he wanted to use it to kind of just basically take a dig at Americans for their treatment of the Native American Indians in the United States, or at least to justify British colonialism as well. But basically, he started making comparisons with the United States and how it works, its relationship, and how it has treated Native Americans in the United States versus how the British are treating the Indians. And so basically the lecture was kind of used as a justification for British colonialism. But one of the things that was brought up was basically how the United States treated Native Americans on the frontier. So you would have loved that part in Crosby's book. It's only about half a page, but it's really interesting. But yeah, there's this woman there that he asked her what she does. And what he didn't realize at the time is culturally, that was an inappropriate question for that setting, I guess, at that time. But she basically kind of, for lack of better words, kind of dodged the question, never answered it. I never got any indication what she actually did. But for the most part, they described those interactions fairly well. The one thing I got worried about is while it did show those interactions for the most part very well, one of the things reading through Crosby's book is something that I think is getting the episode, but the show itself is kind of not doing well, is American and British relations within the Royal Air Force. And I think some of this is because you're taking the perspective of the American airmen. There is a level of animosity being treated towards the RAF on screen. And sometimes that's rightfully deserved when we talk about their tactics. But other times, when it's like in an academic setting, I think trying to say that American men are better than, British men when it comes to sexual relations. Sarah can probably talk more about this than I can. That's not necessarily the case. I don't know if y'all saw that scene, but basically how, American men are better than British men or something like that. Yeah. So again, I think the problem we have here is we're having the American airman perspective sometimes too much. And as a result, there's a bias, and that bias is against kind of Royal Air Force officers and members of the Royal Air Force. And the Americans are much better, much more professional, and much more, just better. And so there's a little bit of an animosity that I think is coming out towards the RAF that is in some cases unnecessary and in some cases is not warranted. I don't know if Sarah would like to speak more on that than I could.
I was just thinking with regards to that about how I don't remember what episode I gave this commentary for, but I was talking about the exact quote that they end up using in the episode, right? About Americans being overpaid, oversexed, and over here, right? And thinking about the ways that the British in this example are, like in this episode, we're complaining about Americans and how you see this like cultural clash, right? Where they're saying like Americans are, sleeping with anyone regardless of their class. So basically they're not respecting our class, standards. They're spitting in the streets, they're fighting in pubs, they're getting drunk. And it just made me think about how there's just the sheer number of Americans that are going through these, areas, and how it's kind of like in Australia, right? Just like the sheer numbers and what that means for the people who are living there and like how they view it. But I really love the quote when they said that they are undersexed, underpaid, and under Eisenhower, just to kind of get at more of what Luke was saying, right?
I like that they got your quote in there, Sarah. I think that was great. I was
right?
Sarah must love this episode. You got it in there. I thought that was great. Also, let's talk about how Masters of the Air is totally anti-British, by the way. Anti-British bias. I mean, the whole way through.
Yeah.
Every time a British person speaks, let me say this, a male British officer speaks, it is in no way kind or nice to the Americans.
Yes.
I personally am offended by this as a direct descendant of British people. Like, when was Herbert Chadwick? Like, I couldn't be more British unless I were sitting here with bad food and bad, I don't know, whatever. So, I kept thinking about this particular scene as a mirror to the Pacific when we saw the Aussies complaining about Americans doing the exact same thing. And there's so much animosity built up because they're coming in, taking our girls, blah, 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 and going on, right? And
they have all the condoms, remember?
I've got to
rubber.
imagine.
That's right.
You just had to throw it out again.
Yeah, exactly. So, here at HATM, we're just throwing condoms out left and right. So, follow for more bedtime talk and historians at the movies.
I want to throw in real quick, Jason. Having spent a lot of my time recently, especially working on Pacific bomber crews, the contrast of this idea that these English, these American bomber crews in England, and I know it's not everyone gets to do this, and it's probably more rare than not, but they get to, they have this kind of treatment available in the middle of the war where they can just sort of go off and get some sort of relaxation. There's a, sort of hint that there's a doctor there and stuff like that. Because a lot of the guys in the Pacific don't get the bomber crews out there. They're nowhere near this kind of infrastructure. Those guys are really in mosquito infested, hot, tropical areas. And unless they're flying back to Australia for some reason, they don't get that same kind of treatment. I know it's unfair because this is not every crew gets goes to these flak houses, but it was quite a contrast. I thought, and very interesting.
Yeah, can I just be a little bit more explicit here and just say say this out loud, which was how much of like American strategy as far as or Allied strategies. Let's get the boys off the line, get them laid, and then get them back. It's like how much. I talk about this as in terms of real sexuality here. How much of like say sex was a tool to rehabilitate these guys or get them back in fighting shape? Does that make any sense at all?
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. I think about it all the time. Was this acknowledged
by? Okay, was this acknowledged by the brass? What are we seeing?
I think all the time because we have like sanctioned prostitution in Hawaii that's literally paid for, funded, regulated by the U.S. military during World War II. This is never like talked. Yes. So it's the intention behind it is this will make, like it's the age old, literally, no matter the culture, argument of does having sex make men better fighters or does it make it worse, right? Like for combat, and how much should we remind men of like the home front while they're fighting? It's like always this thing that's discussed. And so these women, like with regulated prostitution, they're like, purpose in the way the military is viewing it is that men will like be better, right? Like because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And so when you think about that, but then you also think about how they're trying to control rates of venereal disease. So they're handing out all these prophylactic kits. And so to them, like what you're doing, when you're away from combat, right, during these periods, it's like not necessarily like encouraged, but it's also not discouraged. And maybe it's sort of encouraged by, the like distribution of condoms. I don't know, but either way, like it's something that the U.S. military assumes is going to happen, if not, outright encouraging it, and assumes that it will make you like help prepare you to like go back to combat. And this is like I'm talking about like histories of sexuality and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I want to flip this on its head for just a second. Next, if we're talking about heterosexual relationships between men and women in this regard, what about homosexual relationships? Do we see that? Do we see officers or other soldiers, or is that coming across in the archive as well? Are men finding companionship with one another? What's going on here as well? Sarah, you're making a face.
Oh yeah, because there's so much to say. So Alan Brube was like, I want to give a shout out to him, this historian. He is the one who was able to really do a lot of oral history interviews with gay men and women who were veterans of World War II specifically. And in his book and in these interviews that he's doing, but also other people have done work on this too. Let me back up. The U.S. military was regulating the sexuality of its service members in this specific way as well. So for their fighting forces, and that includes everyone, so even people that aren't in combat, right? You are not allowed to be gay in the U.S. military. So they literally have these questionnaires for women when they're going into the service, no matter what branch, asking them about if they like to be like weird questions like, do you want to sleep? Do you like sleeping in the same bed with other women? And how close are you with your female friends? Trying to get at, is this so? Because there are these fears of women in military uniform, and will this make them lesbians? And so all the branches of the service have this questionnaire for women, but then for men and also for women, if you are found to be gay, there is an investigative process into that individual. So they're expending like we're talking about like expending resources and time. People are always talking about things that the Nazis are doing, right? In terms of like the bureaucracy of taking note of all these, individuals that they're going to send to these camps and having really good, like thorough records and all the, resources they're expending, even tying up trains, right? For the U.S., I find it interesting that we're expending resources towards a civilian population, and obviously a totally different way, to determine if they're gay or not. And so it was called a blue discharge, and you were discharged from the military if the military decided or determined that you were gay. So if men were caught sleeping with each other, they were immediately, it was all dependent. Most of it was dependent upon people observing something about you and then wanting to report it. So it's the people you're serving with. It can be your commanding officers, etc. But there were men and women who talk about like living in fear a little bit during the war because they were, not sure if they would be like caught for doing things that they found to be normalized, but that might be perceived as gay, right? And so so there were army drag shows where men would dress as women and perform these, plays, right? These shows. And they occurred like on the home front, but also overseas. And when these men would play female characters, they would dress as women, they would wear makeup, they would pad bras and wear bras, wear high heels, the whole thing, and even do their hair or wear wigs. And no one ever like accused them of being gay or, says this is like a scary practice for this, regulation of sexuality. But yet, if you were, found to be in any way, like, right, even if you wrote letters, because some men talked about how they would write letters to their partners and they'd be scared that people would like notice. So they try to word the letters to their partners in such a way that, it would seem like they were friends, etc. So it's like they're being monitored and these resources are being expended for it. But for whatever reason, in other contexts, like you can be overtly heterosexual, right? And that's perfectly acceptable. And yeah, sure, sleep with prostitutes or women overseas. But if you're gay, that is criminalized in the U.S. military, and you literally then, if you're discharged, won't have any benefits after the war.
I want to move on to Rosenthal's group, and let's talk a little bit about the rehabilitation as well. Rosie doesn't want to come off the line. He says, "I've been here for 3 days. I'm in a rhythm here. Let's just get this done and over with." What can we talk about what's going on there with his group and the decision to move them off the line after only 3 days, right? And they're already being sent away for a week. What's going on here?
This is a policy that the 8th Air Force created to try to limit basically psychiatric cases and limit psychiatric stress on air crews. Basically, they had two. Mark Wells wrote a great book about air crews and morale and emotions in psychiatric cases. But basically, there's two, I guess, official diagnoses you could have by a group surgeon, which is operational fatigue, which is short-term stress that you need to be taken off the line. Go to one of these flak farms or flak houses where you regroup and you recharge the batteries. And then there's operational exhaustion, which is we need to take you off for a while, possibly like up to a year. But they really didn't want to do that. But basically what they're doing by there's 15 of these manor houses or hotels around England where they take these guys and they discourage wearing uniforms. The idea is you're going to be there for 3 to 6 days and you're just going to live a non-military life and have fun and relax and just chill out. And after about 6 days, you're back in the fight. That usually is enough to recharge the batteries. This is something that American flight surgeons were really concerned about and American medical officers were concerned about, just to kind of prevent psychiatric cases and to limit the stress of air combat on crews. But even then, the diagnoses, I looked at the numbers, for American Army infantrymen, 250 out of 1,000 emotional casualties that's the breakdown. Is out of 1,000 casualties, 250 would be emotional, which would be some kind of psychiatric episode. But if you break down what the 8th Air Force was looking at, they were at 42.7 out of 1,000, which is far lower than what the rest of the Army's experiencing in terms of infantrymen, which it comes down to 4.27%, of which only 40% of that was taken off flight status. So when we talk about these guys, the 8th Air Force isn't taking that many guys off. And so what they're doing is they're sending them in, recharge, and get them back flying. But even then, they're not doing that very often.
There's also this, historian Jordan Pitt, he's graduating this semester with his PhD from TCU. He's currently finishing up he's defending his dissertation soon about trauma and pilots in the World War II era. And he talks about how there's this medical designation, or I'm using the wrong word, not designation, I guess designation, but also diagnosis of, quote, fear of flying, like FOF is how it's used in the records. And he talks about, kind of like what Luke was saying, about like this, like it can be something that the like U.S. Army Air Force is acknowledging and taking you, if you're diagnosed with it, you're taken off flying duties like temporarily, but the ultimate goal is to get you back right into flying. So it's not like a permanent like condition. And so it's interesting because it's just the language of the framing of it, right? To say like fear of flying. And when we think about trauma, or like what we now understand about trauma compared to back then. So I'm just kind of adding to what Luke said, but I also wanted to give out a shout out to Jordan because he does really good work on trauma and things like that with pilots specifically.
The other thing that I thought was really, I mean, maybe they did it for other storytelling purposes, but for, and Jason, I don't know if you've done this, but I know Luke, Sarah, we've all been to reunions. We've all been to sort of veterans reunions. Now, I wasn't there, in the heydays of the reunions, but I've been to some Vietnam veteran reunions, and where they're all sitting around telling stories and sort of just recounting even what just happened, about Rosie singing and, the song and stuff like that. the cathartic sort of experience of talking about what just happened and them having space to talk about what just happened. That had to have been very valuable then, and I know for sure. I hear about it all the time when I'm talking to the children of veterans every once in a while. If they got to sit in on some of these, sort of just drinking around the table and telling stories about how cathartic it was for those veterans to just sort of talk about it and talk about it routinely, maybe jokingly, also recognizing the seriousness of it. But I don't know. I think that shows how valuable that is, because, of course, for those of us who study this, that's how the oral histories sort of get passed on down the line, and how a lot of these stories come to us in general as well.
And they're also trying to do something else with Rosie here, is they're trying to show the burden of leadership that he feels, the responsibilities that he feels, and how, I mean, this was a real thing with Rosie, is that he felt like he had to always be in the fight. He felt a sense of duty that, even went beyond what most of his other comrades felt. He completed his 25 mission tour of duty and signed up again. Not uncommon for some guys that are really good pilots that feel that same sense. Others, as soon as they get the 25 done, I've survived it, I'm out. Rosenthal did 53 missions. And so he feels that sense of duty. And then even after the war in Europe is over, he was trying to sign up and get checked out in B-29s for the Pacific. And then after the war is over, he starts getting involved in Nuremberg. So he does feel what they're trying to also say is through this whole process is he feels a sense of duty, the sense of responsibility. All this weighs on him, the responsibilities of leadership. And as a result, that stress can really break a person down, just the feeling the weight of the world on your shoulders. And so they're also trying to communicate something about his character and who he is to set us up for, as we go through the rest of the series, we're going to see how he has to basically be that rock that the group really needs.
Well, I mean, so there's a line that Rosenthal has here, and they're starting to be very, explicit here. I think we all know he's Jewish, but he's being very overt, very explicit about this. When they're asking about horses, he's like, "Hey, Jews from Brooklyn don't ride horses, right?" And of course, I can't help but think you've got this explicit line early in the episode, coupled with showing the trains of the Holocaust. You kind of really bringing this aspect of the war into the series. And I'm kind of wondering, Luke, Sarah, Colin, if you know, did Rosenthal remark, say, after the war? We all know he survives the war, obviously, through the Nuremberg. And I'm kind of wondering, did he ever place his own Jewishness, his Jewish identity in context with the war at all? Does that come into play, especially as we start to talk about the Holocaust? Was that a thing for Jewish? Like, my understandings, and forgive me if I'm wrong here, my understanding is that we weren't really aware of the Holocaust, what was going on with the Holocaust early in the war. Is that correct? How do we understand the Holocaust in the war, Sarah?
Yeah, also, maybe you all can speak specifically to Rosenthal, but I was going to say broadly, the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the Smithsonian one in D.C. Memorial Museum, they have a extensive database of newspaper articles that is, I think, continuing to be added to as researchers find articles to show what was newspaper coverage like in different regions of the world about the Holocaust. Because as you all know, in 1939, we're sending away the USS St. Louis, which is a ship full of refugees, primarily Jewish, from, the coast of Florida and Cuba, right? And we send them back because they're, our fears about refugees, right? And things like that. But also, anti-Semitism still very much happening in the US, but also in those newspaper articles, I've gone through some of them pretty extensively because I always get asked by students well, how much did we know? What did we know? We knew about things playing out with the Holocaust throughout the entire war. So even when you think about, because I always tell students, genocides don't happen overnight, right? It's a gradual building of dehumanization. There's different things that play out. And so we see that in newspaper coverage. And so it's very similar to any other time the genocides are happening, right? You see the evolution over time. And then once the camps exist, and we get into that, those stories about concentration camps, or the fact that concentration camps exist, etc., they're often buried. So they're not on the front page of the paper, not even like the second or third, but they're buried in, like, I remember there was one New York Times article where it was on like page 7, and it was like a 2-inch, article about this, right? So the information is there and available, not in great detail, but you really have to be dedicated to international news during a time of war. You really have to be paying attention. Honestly, it might be a little similar to now, right? Where when I talk to my students about what's happening in Gaza, it's like if you're not paying close attention and looking things up for yourself, you might like miss it. But most people who are fighting in Europe are fighting against like Hitler and this larger idea about fascism, and not going to like free the concentration camps, right? Because a lot of times for people like the Egan, example where he doesn't know who won the World Series, Yankees or Cardinals. It's the same thing where these men, especially who are serving overseas, they're not keeping close tabs on all aspects of the war. So for people like my great uncle who liberate concentration camps, they are surprised by what they're seeing. They didn't know the full extent of this. What they saw in Europe is all they knew of it. But I don't know. Luke, do you happen to know if Rosenthal ever specifically frames his experiences or not? Because I don't know that answer.
I appreciate you taking the big picture there, because that gave me enough time to flip to the page. I looked at this actually with Masters of the Air. I have it out right here. That's allowed me to double check this. But there's a paragraph where Donald Miller writes about this in his book, and Rosenthal basically indicates that he would have been opposed to bombing the concentration camps because basically, it would have been an even greater calamity, is what Miller writes. Others say, that it would only have helped Hitler. We wouldn't have been targeting a target that would have helped in the war, and also we'd have been killing fellow Jews. Some said it would have been a betrayal to, So again, most felt that the mission came first, and ending the war was the priority. Now, that's kind of what Donald Miller writes about Rosenthal's perspective and other Jewish Americans who served in the 8th and 15th Air Force, in his paragraph on it, 327, if you're following in your manual, But with regards to the bigger picture, I can talk a little bit more about that. There's the War Department, and there is a lobby by some groups in the United States to bomb the concentration camps, or at least the rail lines, to prevent that from happening, to prevent basically the Holocaust in these camps from getting worse, I guess you could say. Some of the American generals consider it, but they basically say we can't do that. We'd be diverting bombers away from the mission. That is the priority, is winning the war. You don't really know what, the only person that Miller writes about is Frederick Anderson, but I can tell you this. Yes, there was a Holocaust camp struck that I know of during the war. It was Auschwitz. It was Camp 3. Camp 3 was struck because what the Germans were doing is that Camp 3 was the IG Farben synthetic oil facility there. And basically it was considered a target as a part of the oil plan. And so since it was producing synthetic oil, it was struck, and some bombs did hit the rest of the camp as well. So this was a strategic bombing mission to take out the IG Farben facility at Camp 3. But I will say this, is that looking at kind of the damage done and the production, it didn't really warrant the same kind of, shall we say, prioritization, if you're talking about oil targets, that other oil targets got, because its production was not nearly as much as, say, the refineries at Flow West and stuff. But yes, they did attack Auschwitz. They attacked the IG Farben facility there at Camp 3. So, yeah, this is a good topic. There needs to be more research on it. And yeah, I love that we had this conversation on it.
I want to kind of conclude with the big reveal. Buck is alive. Bromance is back on. After we've been talking this whole time about PTSD, Holocaust, the redemption here is like, all of us knew this was coming because I read ahead. And for those who were not watching, the idea that Buck is actually alive after being told that he didn't make it, we never see his off-screen death, this whole question, and I think the idea is like Bucky's constantly trying to find out. These guys really were best friends, were they not?
Oh yeah, they're like an old married couple is the only way to describe it. Because I have it marked down somewhere, but basically when Egan arrives, Clevin says, what the hell took you so long? And Egan basically says something along the lines back to him, well, that's because you're a sentimental fool, kind of indicating, I don't know what was meant by that, but basically, he sees all of his buddies there. He was surprised to see so many from the 100th at the camp. And then he sees, Buck Clevin, when he sees Egan coming in, basically, shouts that at them. And they end up being roommates at the camp. And at times, I think I texted you this in the private text. I came across this, but Buck Clevin recalls later in the, after the war, and it's either an interview or a public talk, that one time, something was throwing him off about one of the camps they were at. And basically he asked Egan asked Buck, hey, can I get in bed with you and get under the sheets with you? Because something's not right about this camp. And I need to get in the top bunk with you. And Buck was basically like, oh, wow, this is a weird camp. You're asking to kind of get with me under the covers. And so, again, it is a very much a bromance. It's a very close friendship. They're roommates in flight training. So this is not like they've known each other for a long time, going back to training. So, and that those bonds are real when you build them through training and throughout the rest of the, your service. But also remember, the Army Air Corps was very small in the 1930s when they were doing their training, which means that there's a lot of guys from that, core group that was when it was very small that know each other and have very close relationships. And so it does not surprise me that you have those kinds of relationships. And yes, it is very much a bromance. I like to call it an old married couple.
Looks like, it looks like Buck lost some weight. They did a good job of sort of making him look a little skinny as well. And I think that the U.S. POW story is undertold in many ways, especially in film. I mean, there's some good stuff out there that maybe even be relevant to this camp itself. But the personalities that were there, what you see happen in prison camps during the war, and they become cities of their own with entire market economies. It's going to be fascinating. I really can't wait to sort of see how they play out what we know sort of happens with their experience in this camp. And again, this is one camp of 6 major Luftwaffe camps, but hundreds of other camps that are filled with prisoners, and all constantly trying to undermine their captors, constantly looking for ways to escape and evade. And I'm excited for it. I think this is going to be, this episode, the last episode was really tense and I really enjoyed it. This episode sort of is starting to drive home to me how really, I think they're doing a really good job. So I'm excited.
I'm also excited to see the POW story told. Yeah. Oh, I was just going to say, I'm also excited to see the POW story for being told for the same reasons. And even thinking about Alexander Jefferson, the Tuskegee Airman, who I mentioned earlier, he talks about like the artwork and the art that he created in the camp. So just the whole culture, I'm just hoping they show us some aspects of that.
Yeah, I guess that maybe that's where we're kind of pushing towards as we head into now episode 7 next week, where we get to see, Colin, you're absolutely right. Aside from maybe The Great Escape, I want to say Hart's War, we don't see a lot of World War II prison camps, especially in Europe, on film. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out, but also how it's depicted on screen. It's such a huge cultural experience. Like I said, 28,000 8th Air Force alone end up in these camps, and of course they're together with. These are multinational camps. These are not just Americans in these places. Sometimes these camps are even broken up. Some are officers, some are enlisted. Sometimes they're mixed, and so it's going to be great to see. And I think there's a lot more, so many more stories to tell. Every single one, as I was just digging into some of these as I was going in, because of course at my job,
I'm really looking sort of at the terminal part of this, of these guys, going missing. And so I don't have as much time to dig into the POW stories. And so digging into them now, every one of them is incredible. I mean, there hasn't been one story I've seen that isn't somehow like almost unbelievable in some way. These guys, of course, this is not a happy story. This is going to be a traumatic story, but it's really important to tell.
Luke?
Again, this is something that I'm glad that they're going to show. And again, I like that they're diverging in the three paths that it looks like they're doing. Because again, I think it gives us a more holistic look, but at the same time, we're not trying to be jack of all trades, master of none in terms of the writing and the execution of this television series. Because again, there's always the risk when you have an overview of the war as the air war as your, book to go with. The danger is you try to tell all of it. And what they've done is they've tried to use certain individuals and personalities to tell that story. And I think picking the ones they have is very good. And again, I think telling the POW experience will be important. I would like to see how they talk about race relations later on when we start talking about the Tuskegee Airmen. And I'm really interested in that. Also concerned, I will say, because you don't have much time to tell that story. So there's a risk there that you don't do it well because you don't have much time. And so again, I still think there's a lot of stories that they have left to tell, and I'm excited to see them going forward. And I hope they continue showing what's happening to the 100th in 1944, because we get this idea that the war all of a sudden got better in 44 for the 8th Air Force. It didn't. Some of the casualties, look at the losses when they had the P-51s. I think I was reading a report recently where 40 were shot down in another attack at Regensburg by the 15th Air Force during, I think it was the Big Week operation. So these casualties are still going to be happening, and I'm glad that we're getting them covered in this television series.
Sarah, final words?
I just want to mention that I would really love it if they, in a future episode, would bring back the ATS, like the British Auxiliary Territorial Service that Westgate is a part of, because I couldn't find any information on her specifically, so I think she must be a composite of stories. So I'm hoping they bring her back in some way. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, awesome. We're heading into our final third, if you will. I guess what is that? Our final trimester? I don't know. We're giving. What are we doing? The last 3 episodes. So I am looking forward to this, guys. Thank you so much for being here, Luke, Sarah, Colin. Thank you for talking about Masters of the Air, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, see ya.